They laughed at the wall she built, until the night the temperature dropped to minus 60 degrees. The wind hit Silver Ridge like a freight train, rattling windows and freezing pipes solid. While the town brushed off the forecast, 69-year-old Clara Whitmore quietly started building a second wall around her cabin, 8 inches out, board by board. It looked strange, excessive, maybe even foolish. But when the power failed and the cold turned deadly, that mistake became the only reason she and her German Shepherd were still warm. Be honest, if your neighbors mocked your idea, would you still build it? Let me know what you'd do. The first warning came in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, carried through the small weather radio that sat on Clara Whitmore's kitchen counter. When she had just finished stacking split pine beside the stove, when the static crackled and a flat, official voice cut through the cabin. Arctic front expected to descend across western Montana within 10 days. Temperatures may drop significantly below seasonal averages. Residents are advised to prepare for extended sub-zero conditions. Claire didn't turn the radio off right away. She stood still, one gloved hand resting on the edge of the counter, listening as the voice moved on to highway closures and livestock advisories. Outside, the sky above the foothills of Silver Ridge was a pale winter blue, almost gentle-looking. The kind of sky that made people believe forecasts were exaggerations. Behind her, Atlas lifted his head from where he lay near the door. The German Shepherd's ears twitched at the change in tone. But when Clara glanced back at him, he settled again, chin on pause, amber eyes watchful. "Extended sub-zero," she murmured. The words lingered in the warm air of the cabin. Clara turned off the radio and crossed to the small wooden table by the window. A neat stack of papers waited there. Last winter's heating bills, scribbled notes, temperature charts she'd kept in careful handwriting. She pulled out a spiral notebook and flipped to a page marked December. She had always tracked things. 40 years as a mechanical engineer had made it a habit she couldn't shake. Systems, numbers, patterns. They told the truth long before people were ready to hear it. Last January, outside temperatures had dipped to -23 for 3 consecutive nights. She'd burned through nearly a quarter quart of wood in 4 days. The interior temperature had hovered stubbornly around 52 degrees. 52 was survivable. 52 was not comfortable. She drew a slow breath and ran her finger down a column of figures. Heat loss along west wall highest during high wind events. She had written that months ago. The west side of the cabin took the brunt of winter storms. The logs there were older, slightly warped from decades of expansion and contraction. She had chinked them herself more than once. Each year the gaps seemed to grow just a little wider. Atlas rose and patted across the floor, nails clicking softly against the pine boards. He nudged her elbow with his nose. "I know," she said, rubbing the thick fur behind his ears. "You hear it too." The cabin wasn't large, just under 800 square feet. Had hand-built from cedar logs, Clara and her late husband had hauled in piece by piece nearly 30 years earlier. It sat on 5 acres of sloping land at the edge of the foothills, 10 miles from town, where the road turned from asphalt to gravel and then to something that was only technically a road. Most folks in Silver Ridge liked to say they lived out in the country. Clara actually did. She moved to the window. From there, she could see the thin ribbon of smoke rising from her stovepipe, bending slightly in the breeze. Snow lay in soft drifts across the clearing. The mountains beyond were already wearing heavy white caps, even though it was only early December. In town, she knew, the talk would already be turning to the forecast. "They'll overstate it," she could almost hear Darren Pike saying from behind the counter at the hardware store. "Every year they scare folks into buying more than they need." Silver Ridge had weathered plenty of storms. The town had survived deeper freezes than this, at least according to memory. But memory was selective. Memory didn't keep logs. Clara returned to the table and did the math again. If temperatures dropped below -30 for a sustained period, and wind chill drove it lower, her current insulation and wood supply would not be enough. Not for 2 weeks. Not for 3. She glanced at the stacked wood near the back wall. 2.5 cords. It looked like plenty. It wasn't. Atlas shifted, sensing the tension in her posture. He moved closer, leaning his weight lightly against her leg. She knelt and wrapped her arms around his thick neck, Well, his coat was already growing heavier for winter, the dense underlayer insulating him against the cold that would soon come. His breath was steady and warm against her cheek. "You'll be fine," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she meant him or herself. The cabin creaked softly as a gust moved across the clearing. Clara closed her eyes and listened. The familiar low whistle along the west wall was faint now, almost polite. In a true Arctic blast, it would sound different, sharper, more insistent, like something trying to get inside. She stood and walked to the west-facing window. The glass trembled slightly in its frame. She pressed her palm against the log beside it. Even in mild cold, the wood felt cool through her skin. A memory flickered. Last winter, waking at 3 a.m. to find Atlas pacing near that same wall. His nose lifted, ears forward. She had dismissed it then as restlessness. Now she wasn't so sure. The radio forecast repeated faintly from the other room, as if echoing in her mind. Extended sub-zero conditions. Clara moved to the small closet near the door and pulled down an old thermometer she used for spot checks. She would take readings later, interior surface temperatures along each wall, compare them to ambient air. Numbers first. Always numbers. Outside, a pickup truck passed along the distant gravel road, tires crunching over frost-hardened earth. The sound faded quickly. No one slowed near her property. No one ever did unless they were lost. Silver Ridge would laugh off the forecast. They always did. She could already picture the conversations. "We've seen worse. It never hits as bad as they say. Just another cold snap." Donna Clara returned to the table and opened a fresh page in her notebook. December 3rd. Arctic front forecast. Evaluate heat retention capacity. Current supply insufficient for extended sub-zero. Her handwriting was steady. Atlas lay down beside her chair, watching as she wrote. His tail thumped once against the floor, then stilled. The afternoon light began to thin, turning the clearing outside a soft gray. The temperature would drop fast after sunset. Clara rose and added another log to the stove, adjusting the damper carefully. The flame caught and spread, casting a warm orange glow across the walls. The cabin felt secure in that moment. Warm, almost defiant against the coming cold. But Clara knew better than to trust a moment. She looked once more at the west wall, at the quiet seams between the logs, and felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, not yet. Just the faint, persistent awareness that winter was not a rumor this time. It was coming, and the wood she had stacked would not be enough. Clara barely slept that night. Not because of the cold. The stove held steady, and Atlas sprawled across the braided rug like a sentry who had declared the perimeter secure, but because her mind would not stop measuring. Every creak of the west wall felt louder. Every shift in the wind seemed like rehearsal. By morning, she had already made a decision. Atlas followed her out to the truck just after sunrise. The sky was a pale winter silver, and the air carried that dry, metallic bite that always preceded deeper cold. She scratched behind his ear, most before closing the door. "I won't be long," she told him. He watched her from the porch, his ears high, as she drove down the narrow road toward Silver Ridge. Town looked exactly the way it always did in early December. Quiet storefronts, a few pickup trucks angled outside the cafe, a wreath hanging crookedly from the hardware store door. The forecast had barely stirred anyone. Inside Pike's Hardware and Supply, the smell of sawdust and oil greeted her. The bell above the door jingled. Darren Pike glanced up from behind the counter. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, permanently sunburned from summers spent guiding rafting trips. He'd grown up in Silver Ridge and had the easy confidence of someone who believed the mountains belonged to him. "Well, if it isn't Miss Whitmore," he said. "You hear the sky's supposed to fall next week?" Clara moved toward the lumber racks without smiling. "Oh, I heard." "You worried?" he asked lightly. "I'm calculating." He laughed at that, shaking his head as if she'd just told a joke. "They say -30, maybe worse. But they say that every few years. Never sticks." Clara ran her hand along a stack of salvage boards leaning against the far wall. Weathered pine, uneven edges, but still solid. She began pulling pieces free, examining their grain. Darren stepped out from behind the counter. "What are you building?" "Insulation frame," she said simply. He looked toward the doorway, then back at her. "For what?" "My cabin." He squinted, as though trying to solve a riddle. "You already insulated that place." "Not enough." Clara gathered a handful of long screws and added them to her cart, along with several sheets of rigid insulation board stored near the back, once Darren folded his arms. "You know," he said, voice softening into something that almost sounded concerned, "there's no shame in moving into town. Plenty of folks your age have done it. Warmer. Easier." She didn't answer right away. She was calculating lengths in her head, subtracting inches for spacing. "You shouldn't have to fight winter by yourself," he added. Clara looked at him then. Not sharply, not defensively, just steadily. "I'm not fighting it," she said. "Then what are you doing?" "Preparing." He gave a short breath of a laugh. "For what? The apocalypse?" She slid the last board onto her cart. "For physics." Darren chuckled again, though this time it sounded uncertain. "Whatever you say." As she paid, she could already feel eyes on her from the back of the store. Two older men near the paint aisle had stopped talking, and one of them tilted his head toward her lumber stack. By the time she loaded the boards into her truck, she knew the story would travel faster than the Arctic front. Clara Whitmore's building something strange. The drive home felt longer than usual. The road wound upward into the foothills, snow crunching beneath her tires. She passed no one on the final stretch. Atlas was waiting exactly where she'd left him, tail lifting when the truck came into view. He trotted alongside as she began unloading. "Looks like it's just you and me, Atlas," she murmured. He watched as she leaned the boards against the cabin's exterior wall. She didn't start building that afternoon. Instead, she went inside, set a pot of coffee on the stove, and pulled out her notebook. She sketched the cabin in profile, marking measurements along the west wall. 8 inches out, continuous air gap, external barrier to block wind shear before it reached the original logs. Her pencil moved steadily. The phone rang just after 4. She let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, Mom." Melissa's voice carried the faint echo of city traffic in the background. "Seattle, 20 years removed from Montana winters." "I saw the weather alert," Melissa continued. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. You know you don't have to stay out there, right? I mean, you've proven whatever you needed to prove." Clara closed her eyes briefly. "Proven what?" "That you can live alone. That you're independent. Everyone knows that." "That's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" Melissa's voice sharpened, worry turning into impatience. "You're almost 70. No, it's okay to make things easier." Clara glanced at the west wall through the window. "It's not about easier," she said quietly. There was a pause on the line. "So what are you doing?" Melissa asked. "Making adjustments." "Adjustments like what?" Clara hesitated. She could hear the city in the background. Sirens faint in the distance, doors closing, life stacked on top of life. She imagined trying to explain heat transfer and air gaps and wind pressure. She imagined explaining why selling the cabin would feel like erasing something. Instead, she said, "I'm reinforcing." Melissa exhaled slowly. "Mom." Clara didn't respond. "You don't have to keep proving you can do this alone." "I'm not proving anything," Clara said, more firmly now. "I'm staying." Another silence. Just promise me you'll call if it gets bad," Melissa said finally. "I will." They hung up. Clara sat at the table for a long moment after the call ended. Atlas rested his chin on her knee, looking up at her with calm, unwavering eyes. Outside, the sun dipped lower behind the ridgeline. She stood, carried her sketchbook to the west wall, and stepped outside into the fading light. The boards leaned against the cabin like waiting soldiers. Clara picked up a measuring tape and extended it across the length of the wall. 8 inches out from the original logs. Enough to create a secondary barrier. Enough to trap still air between layers. From the road below, a truck slowed. She heard it before she saw it. A neighbor, she couldn't tell which one, rolled past at a crawl, The driver's head turned toward her property. Now Clara kept measuring. The truck moved on. Atlas stepped forward, positioning himself between her and the road, ears pricked. She marked the first spot with a pencil. She would not explain. She would not defend. She would build. By the time darkness settled fully over the foothills, Clara had sketched every measurement she needed. The boards were ready. The screws were sorted. Inside, she added another log to the stove and opened her notebook to a fresh page. Second outer wall. 8-inch air gap. Wind barrier before primary structure. Her handwriting was steady. The forecast might be exaggerated. It might not. Either way, she would not wait to find out. The first post went up on a Thursday morning. Clara worked slowly, measuring twice before setting the treated lumber into the frozen ground 8 inches out from the west wall. The soil was stiff with early frost, and each shovel strike rang with a dull metallic resistance. Atlas stood close enough that his shoulder brushed her leg every time she shifted position. "Too close," she murmured gently. He didn't move. The sky hung low and gray, pressing the foothills into a muted silence. Clara braced the first vertical beam, checking it with a level she'd owned for nearly 30 years. The green bubble steadied between the lines. She secured the base and stepped back. One post, a single narrow shadow running parallel to the original cabin wall. From a distance, it looked like nothing. By noon, there were 5. The narrow skeletal outline of a second frame began to take shape, hovering just beyond the cedar logs like an unfinished echo of the house itself. Atlas lifted his head sharply at the sound of gravel crunching below. A pickup truck rolled past at a crawl, its engine louder than necessary. Clara didn't turn. She drove another screw through the support beam, the drill whining briefly before falling silent. The truck idled longer than it should have. Atlas let out a low growl. "Leave it," Clara said quietly. The truck moved on. She worked until her gloves stiffened with cold. Horizontal braces came next, linking the vertical posts together. The gap between old wall and new frame was deliberate, wide enough to trap still air, narrow enough to remain manageable. By late afternoon, the west side of her cabin had begun to look altered. Not renovated, not improved. Altered. And she could see it clearly when she stepped back toward the tree line. The original cedar logs had once given the cabin a clean, rustic profile. Now, thin boards and protruding supports made the structure look uneven, almost swollen on one side. Atlas trotted forward and sniffed along the new lumber, then returned to her side. "It's not pretty," she admitted. The next morning, she added insulation board along the outer frame. The rigid panels caught the light differently than the cedar, their pale surfaces glaring against the weathered wood. From the road below, the cabin no longer looked like a simple mountain retreat. It looked like something patched together. The third day brought visitors, not invited ones. 2 trucks parked along the gravel shoulder mid-morning. Clara was on a ladder, securing the upper brace, when she heard voices. "Well, I'll be." She didn't look down immediately. Darren Pike stood near the base of the clearing, hands shoved into his coat pockets. Beside him was Ray Holloway, who ran the local feed store. Both men tilted their heads, studying the cabin. "What is she doing?" Ray asked. "Looks like she's building a fence around her own house," Darren said. They both laughed. Atlas planted himself at the foot of the ladder, body rigid. Clara tightened the final screw and climbed down carefully. "You need something?" she asked evenly. Darren shrugged. "Just curious. Whole town's curious." "About what?" He gestured broadly at the frame. "About this. It's an outer barrier." "For what?" "For wind." Ray shook his head. "You planning to insulate the outside of your insulation?" Clara didn't answer. Darren squinted at the uneven siding. "You know that's gonna look strange, right? Folks drive by, they're gonna think—" "I don't care what they think," she said, more sharply than intended. Silence followed. Ray cleared his throat. "You ever think maybe it's time to move closer to town, Clara? No shame in it." Atlas growled low again. Darren took a half step back. "Easy, boy." "He won't bite," Clara said, "unless he thinks you're a threat." Ray gave a dry chuckle. "We're not the threat." They didn't stay long, but they didn't leave quietly either. As their trucks rolled away, Ray's voice carried back across the clearing. "Looks like she's building herself a coffin." The word landed heavier than the wind. Coffin. Clara stood still for a moment, ladder beside her, drill hanging loosely in her hand. Atlas pressed against her leg. The cabin did look strange now, bulky on one side, patchwork boards layered unevenly, the clean lines of the original structure distorted by something half-finished and stubborn. She imagined how it appeared from town. Old widow, isolated cabin, now wrapping it in lumber like she was sealing herself inside. Embarrassment crept up slowly, settling into her chest like cold air through an open seam. She hadn't expected that part. It was easier to calculate wind resistance than to measure humiliation. That afternoon, more vehicles passed than usual. Some slowed. One honked once, sharp and unnecessary. Clara kept working. She added diagonal supports to stabilize the frame. She adjusted spacing to maintain the 8-inch air gap precisely. And she triple-checked alignment along the west corner where the worst gusts typically struck. But the feeling lingered. Every screw she drove sounded louder. Every board she lifted felt heavier. By evening, she stepped back once more to inspect her progress. The west side of her cedar cabin was now partially encased in a pale outer shell. It wasn't complete. It wasn't clean. It wasn't attractive. It looked, if she was honest, like a mistake. Atlas moved to stand in front of her, facing the road. His ears were forward, body steady, as if guarding something invisible. Clara knelt and rested her forehead briefly against his. "They'll talk," she said softly. He blinked slowly, unbothered. Inside, she stoked the fire and sat at the table with her notebook open. She did not record what Ray had said. She did not write the word coffin. Yet instead, she listed the remaining materials needed to seal the outer layer fully. She knew the structure looked awkward now. She knew the town saw a woman patching her house in desperation. The cabin creaked as night settled in. Clara listened carefully. The faint whistle along the west wall was still there, and she reminded herself quietly that appearances were not data. But when she turned off the lamp and climbed into bed, she lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling beams. Outside, the wind moved gently through the clearing, and for the first time since she started building, Clara wondered if they might be right. Sleep came in fragments. The stove ticked softly as it cooled between logs, and the cabin gave its familiar nighttime sighs, wood settling, rafters adjusting, the subtle language of a structure that had survived decades of winters. Clara lay awake longer than usual, staring at the dark outline of the ceiling beams. Atlas, who normally slept through anything short of a thunderclap, was restless. Around midnight, he rose abruptly from his place near the hearth. His nails clicked against the floorboards as he paced toward the west wall. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He just stood there, rigid, ears forward, nose lifted slightly, as if scenting something unseen. "Atlas," Clara whispered from the bed. He didn't turn. She pushed herself upright and listened. At first she heard nothing unusual, just wind brushing the outer boards she'd installed that week. But then, beneath it, there was something sharper, a thin, high-pitched thread of sound slipping through the room. A whistle. Not loud. Well, not dramatic. Just persistent. Atlas pressed closer to the wall. Clara swung her legs over the edge of the bed and pulled on her robe. The floor felt colder than it had the night before. She crossed the room and stood beside him. The west wall. She held her palm near the cedar logs, just inches from the seam between two timbers. There it was. A ribbon of cold air slicing through a hairline crack, so thin it would have been invisible during daylight. She moved her hand along the seam. Another draft. Lower, near the corner, stronger than she remembered. Atlas exhaled softly, fogging the air. "You heard it," she murmured. She fetched a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and aimed the beam along the interior wall. The logs looked intact. The chinking between them appeared solid, but appearances had fooled her before. And she knelt and pressed her cheek near the wood. Cold. Sharper than it should have been. She stood and crossed to the small supply cabinet where she kept her thermometer kit. The handheld infrared device had been a tool of curiosity for years, used to test window seals, to compare stovetop surfaces, to measure how much heat escaped through glass. Now she aimed it at the west wall. The red laser dot settled on the wood. 51 degrees. She turned toward the center of the room. 58. 7-degree difference. She moved the device lower. 48. She swallowed. The stove was burning normally. The air temperature near the center of the cabin was steady. But along that wall, the surface temperature dropped drastically. Atlas shifted, then paced 2 feet to the right. Clara followed him. Another seam. She tested it. 46 degrees. The difference wasn't dramatic enough to alarm a casual observer. But Clara wasn't casual. She turned off the flashlight and stood in silence, listening more carefully than she ever had before. The whistle wasn't coming from one crack. It was coming from several. Wind didn't need wide openings to steal heat. It only needed weakness. Atlas let out a low rumble deep in his chest. Clara reached down and placed her hand on his neck. His fur was thick, warm beneath her fingers. She felt suddenly protective in a way she hadn't expected, not of the cabin, but of him. If the Arctic front intensified, those seams would widen. Pressure from sustained wind could force air through even tighter spaces. The original cedar logs had served her well for decades, but they were aging, drying, shifting. Yet the outer frame she'd begun building had been cautious, methodical, almost theoretical. Now it felt urgent. She moved back to the table and opened her notebook, the beam of the flashlight resting across the page. December 6th. Surface temperature variance along west wall, 10 to 12 degrees lower than interior average. Multiple draft points identified. She paused, listening again. Atlas lay down at her feet, but his ears remained tilted toward the wall. Clara returned to the seam near the window and ran her fingers slowly along it. The chinking had thinned in places. Microscopic fractures had formed over time, invisible unless tested under stress. She had noticed subtle changes last winter. Longer burn times, more wood consumed for the same warmth. She had attributed it to age, to efficiency loss, to the natural cost of living in a remote structure. But this was different. This was a structural vulnerability. The outer wall was no longer an experiment in insulation. It was a necessary wind barrier. She straightened slowly, joints stiff from kneeling. Atlas finally relaxed, his posture easing as if satisfied that she understood. "You were right," she whispered. She added another log to the stove and watched the flame catch. The firelight flickered against the uneven boards of the unfinished outer frame outside the window. In the dark, it looked skeletal, temporary, not enough. Clara crossed to the door and stepped briefly onto the porch. The air cut sharply against her skin. The night sky was clear, stars bright and merciless. She walked around the cabin to the west side. The outer frame stood partially completed, its boards casting thin shadows across the snow. The 8-inch gap between layers looked narrow now, vulnerable in its incompleteness. She placed her hand against the outer posts. The wind hit that surface first, but until the structure was sealed and insulated fully, it wasn't absorbing enough force. She returned inside and shut the door firmly behind her. The embarrassment from earlier in the day felt distant now. The word coffin had lost its sting. Data had replaced doubt. The west wall was losing heat faster than she had calculated. If sustained -30 temperatures arrived with wind, the interior drop would accelerate. Wood consumption would spike. She could already see the numbers shifting in her head. Atlas lifted his head once more, then settled. Clara turned off the flashlight and sat at the table again. This time, she drew a heavier outline around the west wall on her sketch. She circled the word reinforcement. Tomorrow, she would finish sealing the frame. She would add insulation board fully across the exposed sections. She would secure every joint before the Arctic front had a chance to test it. This was no longer about appearing prepared. It was about preventing failure. She glanced once more at the seam where Atlas had stood. The whistle had faded for the moment, but Clara understood something now that she hadn't fully grasped before. The cabin had been whispering warnings. Atlas had simply heard them first, and she would not ignore them again. Clara was outside before sunrise. The sky was still a deep iron blue, the kind that promised colder hours ahead. Frost coated the clearing in a brittle sheen, and each step across the snow made a sound like crushed glass under her boots. She moved with quiet urgency. The outer frame along the west wall needed sealing, fully sealed. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. Atlas followed her, breath puffing white in the dim light. He stayed close, circling when she carried boards, watching the tree line as if the wind itself might try something. Clara climbed the ladder and began securing the upper insulation panels. The screws resisted slightly in the hardened wood. She leaned her weight into the drill, steady, precise. The forecast had said 10 days, but forecasts did not consult the mountains. By mid-morning, the air changed. It wasn't obvious at first. There was no dramatic shift, no visible wall of snow advancing across the valley, just a subtle tightening in the atmosphere. When the wind direction shifted, colder, sharper, cutting from the northwest. Clara felt it on the back of her neck. Atlas lifted his head at the same time. The first gust hit an hour later. It tore across the clearing with a force that made the unfinished panels rattle against their fastenings. Clara gripped the ladder tightly as the frame shuddered. "Not yet," she muttered under her breath. Snow began to fall, fine, dry flakes at first, carried sideways by the wind. Within minutes, visibility narrowed. This wasn't in the forecast. She climbed down and circled the west side of the cabin, inspecting every joint. The uppermost section remained partially exposed, 3 panels not yet secured. If the wind strengthened, it would exploit that weakness. Atlas pressed close to her thigh as another gust ripped across the clearing. Clara looked toward the ridge. The tree line had disappeared behind a curtain of white. The storm had come 3 weeks early. She didn't hesitate. Clara climbed back up the ladder. The wind was stronger now, pushing hard enough to sway the frame beneath her hands. Snow struck her face in sharp bursts, stinging her cheeks. She steadied herself and lifted the first insulation panel into place. The panel caught the wind like a sail. Atlas barked sharply from below. "Easy," she called down, though her voice barely carried. She pressed her shoulder into the board, forcing it flush against the frame. The drill slipped once against the screw head before catching. The motor whined, and the screw bit into the wood. One secured. The gusts grew more aggressive, tearing at her coat, tugging at the ladder legs. She adjusted her footing carefully. Halfway through the second panel, a sudden blast of wind hit the side of the ladder. It shifted. Not enough to fall, but enough to tilt. Atlas lunged forward instinctively, bracing himself against the base of the ladder. His weight pressed hard into the metal legs, anchoring it against the frozen ground. Clara froze for half a second, pulse hammering in her ears. "Good boy," she breathed. She tightened her grip and drove the screw home. Snow thickened, swirling in tight spirals across the clearing. The outer frame groaned under the pressure of sustained wind, but it held. The final panel was the hardest. Her gloves were stiff. Her fingers ached. The screw refused to seat properly on the first attempt. The wind roared louder, now a steady howl rather than isolated gusts. Atlas didn't move, and Clara adjusted the panel again, pushing harder than she thought she could. The screw caught. She drove it deep. When the last fastener bit into the wood, she felt something inside her settle. She climbed down slowly, legs unsteady. The west wall stood fully sealed, not insulated yet, not packed with final materials, but enclosed, protected by a second barrier that now faced the storm head-on. She gathered her tools blindly as the snowfall intensified. The world beyond the clearing was nearly erased. Inside the cabin, she slammed the door shut behind her and leaned against it, catching her breath. Atlas shook off snow violently, spraying icy droplets across the floor. The stove still burned, steady and warm. Clara crossed the room and pressed her palm against the west interior wall. Cold, but not biting. All the high-pitched whistle she'd heard the night before was muted now, reduced to a dull hum behind wood and air. The storm raged through the afternoon. Wind speeds climbed steadily, and snow piled up against the outer barrier she had just finished sealing. The frame trembled at times, boards rattling sharply under impact. Clara watched carefully for signs of failure. There were none. As night fell, the blizzard intensified. Snow buried the base of the outer wall in a thick white drift. The clearing vanished entirely, replaced by a white void. Clara fed the stove cautiously, monitoring burn rate. Atlas lay near the door, ears occasionally flicking at louder gusts. She moved to the thermometer mounted near the center beam. 55 degrees. She waited. Hours passed. The wind did not let up. At midnight, she checked again. 53. A drop, but manageable. She crossed to the west wall and pressed her hand against the logs. Still cold, but not the piercing cold of the previous night. The outer barrier was absorbing the worst of it. Clara sank into her chair and closed her eyes briefly. The storm tested the structure relentlessly. Outside, snow and wind hurled themselves against wood and insulation, searching for weakness. Inside, the air remained steady enough to breathe without seeing frost in the corners. Atlas shifted closer, resting his head on her boot. The night stretched long and loud, but the wall did not fail. By dawn, the wind had begun to ease. Snow drifted waist-high along the western side of the cabin. Clara opened the door cautiously and stepped into the pale gray light. The outer wall stood firm, the snow packed tightly against it, but no panels had loosened. No screws had torn free. No visible damage. Atlas stepped beside her, surveying the clearing as if assessing a battlefield. Clara ran her hand along the outer boards. They were cold to the touch, nearly frozen, but intact. The storm had come early, and the wall had endured. She looked back at the cabin's original cedar logs, hidden now behind their new barrier. Whatever the town might say about how it looked, it had just faced its first test, and it was still standing. The morning after the storm arrived quietly. No wind, no howl, just a heavy stillness that blanketed the clearing. Snow rested thick against the outer wall, packed firm along the base like a natural brace. The sky above Silver Ridge was a hard, brittle blue, the kind that promised colder air settling in behind the storm front. Clara stood outside with Atlas at her side, studying the structure in daylight. The outer boards were rimmed with frost, pale and stiff. A few screwheads gleamed in the sun, but nothing had shifted. Nothing had split. The 8-inch gap between the original cabin and the new barrier remained intact, hidden but present. She brushed snow from the lower edge of the outer wall and crouched to inspect the base supports. Solid. Atlas paced slowly along the perimeter, nose close to the wood. When he found nothing alarming, he looked back at her as if to say, "See?" Clara exhaled and stepped back inside. The stove had burned steadily through the night. The air felt warmer than she expected. Not cozy, not soft, but stable. She walked straight to the thermometer mounted on the center beam. 57 degrees. She paused. The outside temperature reading hung from a small hook by the door. She stepped outside briefly to check it. -31. She stood very still. The difference wasn't simply survival range. It was significant. Back inside, she closed the door carefully and crossed to the west wall. She raised her infrared thermometer again, aiming the red dot across the interior surface. 52 degrees. She moved toward the center of the room. 58. A 6-degree variance. Before the outer wall, the drop along that surface had been 10 to 12 degrees lower than ambient interior air. Now the gap had narrowed dramatically. Clara walked to the table and opened her notebook. On outside, -31 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior center, 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior west wall surface, 52 degrees Fahrenheit. She stared at the numbers. Then she calculated wind chill. Sustained winds during the storm had reached an estimated 25 miles per hour, based on reports from town. That placed wind chill near -70. She did the conversion carefully, writing each line in steady script. Effective exterior exposure, approximately -70 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chill. Interior ambient, 57 degrees Fahrenheit. She circled the difference. 41 degrees warmer than exterior wind chill. She looked at the number again. 41. It felt unreal. She had not expected that much. Atlas rose and patted over, resting his chin lightly against the table's edge. She ran her fingers through the thick fur at his neck without looking away from the page. 41, she murmured. The figure wasn't magic, and it wasn't impossible. It was physics. Wind shear reduced before it hit the primary structure, trapped air buffering temperature exchange, snow adding additional insulation along the outer barrier. But seeing it written down changed something. The cabin no longer felt like it was enduring winter. It felt like it was resisting it. Clara stood and walked once more to the west wall. She pressed her palm flat against the interior log. It was cool, but no longer biting. The high whistle from 2 nights ago was gone entirely. Only a dull, distant hum remained, wind hitting wood outside the outer barrier. Atlas moved toward the door and settled near it, relaxed. He was not pacing, not restless. The clearing beyond the window looked deceptively peaceful. Sunlight caught the snow in bright flashes, while no sign remained of the violence that had tested the cabin overnight. Clara poured herself a cup of coffee and stood near the stove, letting the warmth reach her hands. She had expected the wall to help. She had not expected it to perform this well. The difference in burn rate was noticeable too. The stove had required fewer logs than it would have during similar conditions last winter. She checked the woodpile inside the cabin. She had used nearly a third less overnight than comparable entries in her records. She returned to the notebook and wrote, "Wood consumption reduced. Heat retention significantly improved." Her handwriting was firmer now. The word mistake did not appear on the page. She stepped outside once more, Atlas following at her heel. The air was brutal against exposed skin, but the outer wall shielded the cabin from direct wind. Snow had drifted along its length, creating an additional insulating layer. From the road below, the cabin looked different now. Still awkward, still layered, but sturdy. She imagined what Darren would say if he saw the numbers. She imagined Ray Holloway shaking his head, dismissing the math in favor of pride. Clara didn't need them to understand. She only needed the data. Inside, she mounted a second thermometer near the west wall to monitor variance over the next few days. She adjusted the damper on the stove slightly lower, testing how long the heat would hold without additional logs. Atlas stretched out fully on the rug, sighing deeply, his body language looser than it had been all week. The storm had come early. The outer wall had held. And now the cabin felt different, not in appearance but in behavior. It retained. It absorbed. It resisted. Clara sat down at the table again and stared at the circled number on the page. 41 degrees warmer than exterior wind chill. It was more than she had dared hope for. And for the first time since she began building, she allowed herself a small, private smile. They could laugh at how it looked, but it was working. For 3 days after the early storm, Silver Ridge settled back into its usual rhythm. Roads were cleared, snowbanks carved back. Conversations at the cafe turned from the blizzard to Christmas decorations and elk sightings. Clara kept measuring. Morning readings, evening readings, surface temperatures along the west wall compared to the north and east. Wood consumption logged carefully in her notebook. Thus the numbers stayed consistent. Atlas grew calmer by the day, no longer pacing near the west wall at night. He stretched long by the stove, confident in the barrier that now stood between them and the wind. Then the second forecast came. This one did not sound like background noise. Record-breaking Arctic intrusion expected, the weather radio announced late Sunday afternoon. Wind chills potentially reaching -60 or lower. Residents are advised to prepare for power disruptions and prolonged exposure risks. Clara stood very still as the words filled the cabin. -60. That was no exaggeration. Atlas lifted his head again, as he had the first time, ears turning toward the radio's metallic voice. Clara turned it off slowly. The outer wall had handled -31 and heavy wind, but -60 wind chill was another level entirely. Sustained cold, brutal pressure, infrastructure failure. She moved to the woodpile and counted what remained. She had burned less since installing the outer barrier, but she would not assume comfort. She stacked additional logs inside along the interior wall, creating another layer of insulation by sheer mass. By Tuesday afternoon, the air itself felt wrong. Not windy, not stormy. Still. The sky was a pale, hollow blue, the kind that made sound carry farther than it should. In town, furnaces roared to life across Silver Ridge. Electric heaters hummed in living rooms. Space heaters plugged into aging outlets worked overtime. Clara knew many homes relied on electric baseboard heating. Others ran propane systems dependent on powered ignition. When the cold sank deep enough, it would strain everything. The first sign came just after dusk. Atlas stiffened near the window, head angled toward town. Clara heard it a moment later, a distant pop. Then another. The kind of sound power lines make under sudden contraction. She stepped outside onto the porch. Across the valley, scattered lights flickered. Then several went dark all at once. The temperature had already dropped below -20 by early evening. The wind had begun to rise, not in wild gusts, but in steady cutting waves that pressed against the outer wall. Inside, Clara checked her thermometer. Exterior, -26 and falling. Interior, 56. She added one log to the stove. The wind strengthened by 10 o'clock. Snow began again, lighter than the first storm, but more relentless. At 10:43 p.m., the valley went black, and Clara saw it through the window. The sudden extinguishing of dozens of distant lights in Silver Ridge. The power had failed. She stood in silence, watching the dark swallow the town. Atlas moved closer to her leg. Without electricity, electric heating systems would die immediately. Propane furnaces without ignition power would shut down. Homes that relied on space heaters would cool rapidly. The temperature outside read -34. It would drop further before dawn. Clara moved through the cabin methodically. She checked stove temperature, adjusted airflow, ensured no gaps along the doorframe. She reinforced a lower seam in the outer barrier where wind struck hardest, driving an additional screw through a support beam by lantern light. The outer wall shuddered occasionally under the increasing wind, but it did not rattle. Midnight arrived with the wind howling steadily across the clearing. Snow scraped against the outer boards like handfuls of thrown sand. The thermometer read -40. Inside, the air remained steady at 52. Atlas paced once, then lay down near the door, alert but not panicked. Clara sat in her chair, watching the stove flame rise and fall. The valley below remained dark. She imagined families inside their homes, watching their breath fog in their own living rooms, pipes ticking, walls creaking, children bundled in blankets. The cold did not discriminate. At 1:18 a.m., headlights cut through the blowing snow at the edge of her clearing. Clara stood slowly. One set of lights became two, then three. Engines strained against deepening drifts as vehicles climbed the narrow road toward her cabin. Atlas was already at the door, body rigid, ears forward, not growling this time, but intensely focused. The trucks pulled into her clearing and idled. Doors opened. Silhouettes stepped into the snow. Clara recognized one immediately. Darren Pike. He moved toward the porch, hunched against the wind, snow plastered across his coat. Behind him, a woman clutched two children close, their faces buried against her sides. Another truck door slammed. An older man stepped out slowly, wrapped in a blanket. Behind him, a young pregnant woman struggled against the wind, guided by someone Clara didn't recognize in the blowing dark. Darren climbed the porch steps and knocked hard against the door. The sound cut through the wind like a plea. Clara did not open it immediately. She met Atlas's gaze first. His tail was not tucked, while his posture was steady, not threatened, concerned. She reached for the handle. The cold outside pressed in even before the door swung wide. Darren's face was pale, his breath ragged. "Our furnace went out," he said quickly. "Power's down across town. We've got no heat. Pipes are freezing. The kids—" His voice broke slightly. "We heard yours was holding." Behind him, the others waited silently, faces tight with cold and fear. Snow whipped sideways across the porch. The wind screamed against the outer barrier, but inside the cabin the air was still. Clara looked past Darren at the families standing in her clearing. She felt the weight of her wood supply, the size of her space, the margin of safety she had calculated carefully. Atlas stepped forward first, moving calmly to the edge of the doorway. He did not bark, while he did not growl. He simply stood there. Clara tightened her grip on the handle for half a second longer. Then she stepped aside. "Come in," she said. The first wave of cold rushed across the threshold as bodies hurried inside. Snow melted instantly on the warm floorboards. Children clung to coats. Breath fogged heavily in the doorway before fading in the steady interior heat. The cabin filled quickly. 15 people, then more. Boots thudded against wood. Voices murmured apologies. Fear hung thick in the air. Atlas moved gently between them, brushing against small legs, offering warmth without demand. Clara closed the door firmly. Outside, the wind intensified. Inside, the thermometer still read 51. The outer wall groaned under pressure, but held. And the night had only just begun. But the cabin felt smaller with every breath. Boots lined the doorway in a damp, uneven row. Snow melted into shallow puddles on the floorboards before Clara handed out old towels from a cedar chest near the stove. Darren's wife, Lacey, clutched her youngest close. The boy's cheeks flushed red from cold. 2 other children stood silently near the table, eyes wide as they took in the unfamiliar space. "Sit close to the stove," Clara instructed calmly. "Not too close. We need circulation." Her voice surprised even her. Steady, measured, almost clinical. Darren nodded quickly, guiding his family toward the hearth. Behind them, Ray Holloway eased himself into a chair, his breath shallow but stabilizing. The pregnant woman, Nora Jensen, sank slowly onto a folded blanket near the inner wall, her husband kneeling beside her. And Atlas moved among them with quiet intention. He brushed gently against the children first, letting them bury cold fingers into his thick fur. He circled Nora once, then settled near her feet, radiating steady warmth. Clara stepped to the thermometer. Interior, 51 degrees. Exterior, -42 and dropping. The wind slammed hard against the west side, rattling the outer barrier. A few people flinched at the sound. "What was that?" one of the older neighbors whispered. "Wind hitting the outer wall," Clara replied. "It's supposed to take the force." Ray looked toward the west interior wall, eyes narrowing. "That thing you built?" "Yes." Another blast shook the structure. The children froze. Atlas lifted his head but did not move. Clara crossed to the west wall and pressed her palm against the logs. Not cool, but stable. No whistle. No biting draft. She returned to the stove and adjusted the airflow slightly, careful not to overfeed the flame too quickly. 15 bodies added heat, but they also added oxygen demand. "Crack the vent near the door," she told Darren. He obeyed without question. The room settled into a tense rhythm. The storm outside roared like a freight train, sustained and merciless. Snow scraped across the outer boards in harsh, constant waves. At 2:17 a.m., another knock came. 3 sharp strikes against the door. Every head turned. Clara hesitated only a moment before crossing the room. Atlas rose with her, tail level, posture alert. When she opened the door, the wind nearly tore it from her hand. 2 more figures stood there. An elderly couple from the far edge of town, wrapped in quilts, at faces pale beneath frost. "Our pipes burst!" the man shouted over the wind. "We can't stay!" Clara stepped aside again. Inside, space tightened further. Bodies shifted closer together. Knees touched. Shoulders brushed. Breath warmed the air. 15, Clara counted quietly. Then 17. The stove crackled steadily. The thermometer dipped briefly to 49 degrees before climbing back to 50. Outside, wind chill readings approached -60. Clara's eyes moved constantly. West wall, stove, vent, ceiling seams. She noticed a faint tremor in the outer structure during one particularly violent gust. The west side groaned low, deep in the wood, but the sound passed quickly. Darren leaned closer to her. "How's it holding?" "Better than town," she answered. He swallowed, while one of the children began to cry softly. Not from cold now, but from exhaustion. Atlas shifted closer and lowered his body along the floor, allowing the little girl to lean against him. Her sobs quieted almost immediately. Nora winced slightly, her hand tightening around her husband's sleeve. "You all right?" Clara asked. "Just tired," Nora said, managing a small nod. Clara brought her a mug of warm water from the kettle and tucked another blanket around her shoulders. The wind intensified again, hitting the outer wall with a sharp, flat slam that rattled dishes in the cabinet. A few people gasped. Clara stood. "I need to check the west seam," she said. Darren moved as if to stop her, but she was already at the door. She stepped into the storm. Snow struck her face instantly, blinding and brutal. The wind tried to push her sideways across the porch. She gripped the railing and made her way around the side of the cabin. The outer wall took the full assault. Snow had piled high against its base, forming a dense drift. The insulation panels held firm. No gaps, no torn screws. The structure flexed slightly under sustained pressure, but flexing was not failure. It was absorption. Clara leaned close and listened. The wind hit the outer boards with force, then dulled within the air gap. The original cedar logs behind them remained shielded. She pressed her hand against the outer barrier. It vibrated under the strain, but it held. Back inside, she shut the door quickly, stomping snow from her boots. "How is it?" Ray asked. "It's doing what it's supposed to do." Silence followed. Outside, the storm raged harder than it had all night. Inside, bodies huddled close together, forming their own insulating circle around the stove. The thermometer read 50 degrees. Atlas lay fully stretched now, 2 children resting against his side. His breathing was slow, steady. Hours crawled by. The stove burned evenly. Clara rationed wood carefully, adding only what was necessary. The outer wall absorbed blow after blow from the Arctic wind. Around 4 a.m, the wind finally began to lose its sharp edge. Not calm, but shifting. Interior temperature held at 48. Still survivable. Still steady. Clara sat down slowly in her chair, exhaustion settling into her bones. Darren caught her eye across the room. There was no laughter in his expression now. No skepticism. Only something else. Gratitude. Outside, the storm did not end, but it weakened just enough to let the cabin breathe. And inside that small, once-mocked structure, 17 people waited for dawn, alive, warm, and holding together. The first gray light of morning crept through the narrow window above the sink. No one had truly slept. They had drifted in and out of shallow rest, heads tipped against walls, shoulders pressed close for warmth. The stove glowed low but steady, its iron sides radiating a dependable heat that had become the center of the room's gravity. Clara rose stiffly from her chair. The thermometer read 47 degrees, lower than before, but holding. She crossed to the west wall again, palm flat against the cedar logs. Cool, stable, no sharp draft cutting through. The outer barrier continued to absorb the brunt of the wind, which now howled in long, tired stretches rather than violent bursts. Atlas lifted his head as she moved. 2 children still leaned against him, their small hands tangled in his fur. He remained perfectly still, eyes half-lidded, but alert. "Still good?" Darren asked quietly from near the stove. "Still good," Clara replied. She checked the exterior reading through the small digital monitor she had mounted near the door. -48. Wind chill calculations placed it near -60. Inside, they were nearly 90 degrees warmer than the outside wind chill. The number steadied her. Ray Holloway shifted in his chair, rubbing his hands together. "I've never seen it like this," he muttered. Clara didn't answer. She was listening. The wind struck the outer wall again, but the sound was different now. Less sharp, more distant. The air gap between the 2 walls dulled the force, converting the violent strike into a muted thud. She moved toward the lower corner of the west side and crouched, examining a small seam near the baseboard. Condensation had begun to form lightly, where interior heat met the cooler wood surface. That could become a problem if unmanaged. She fetched a strip of additional insulation and pressed it carefully into the narrow gap along the interior trim. Darren stepped forward immediately. "What do you need?" he asked. "Hold this," she said, handing him the flashlight. He obeyed without hesitation. She drove 2 short screws into a small support brace, reinforcing the lower edge of the interior barrier. It wasn't dramatic work, not heroic, but it mattered. "Air moves low first," she explained simply. "Oh, we keep it sealed." Darren nodded. In the corner, Nora shifted slightly, her face pale but calm. Atlas rose and repositioned himself beside her without being asked, offering warmth and quiet presence. Clara rose slowly, joints protesting. She added another log to the stove. Just one. Enough to raise interior temperature gradually without burning through supply too quickly. The cabin had become a system now. 17 bodies added heat. The stove maintained core temperature. The outer wall absorbed wind shear. Snow drifted against the barrier, increasing insulation naturally. Each element supported the others. The storm outside raged again mid-morning, a final surge of Arctic force that rattled dishes and made one of the children cry out. Atlas stood immediately, placing himself between the door and the group. His tail was steady, and posture confident. Clara crossed to the window and peered through a small clearing in the frost. The outer wall stood firm, snow packed nearly halfway up its height. The drift had formed a dense, insulating mound along the western side. The structure flexed, but flexing was strength. Inside, the thermometer ticked upward. 49. 50. A subtle warmth began to return to faces around the room. Someone let out a quiet laugh, nervous, almost disbelieving. "We're still warm," Lacey whispered. Clara glanced toward the notebook on the table. She had not expected to use her calculations for anyone but herself and Atlas. Now they mattered to everyone. By noon, the wind began to taper in earnest. Not silence, but softer, less violent. The sky outside shifted from harsh gray to a clearer winter blue. Clara opened the door briefly to clear damp air. A rush of cold flooded in, but it no longer felt like a predator. It felt distant. She stepped outside carefully. The clearing was transformed into a white landscape of sculpted drifts. The outer wall was nearly buried halfway along its base, but intact. Every screw held, every board aligned. The cabin had become, quite literally, an island of heat. She walked along the west side, brushing snow away from the lower vent opening she had intentionally left adjustable. Airflow remained controlled. No ice blockage. Atlas joined her, stepping through snow nearly up to his chest, tail cutting a slow arc behind him. Clara pressed her hand once more against the outer barrier. Cold, but not penetrating. When she returned inside, the room felt warmer still, 52 degrees. The people began to stretch. Shoulders relaxed. Voices grew steadier. Ray looked toward the west wall, then back at Clara. "That thing you built," he said slowly. "It's the only reason we're not frozen." No one laughed. No one joked. Darren met her eyes directly for the first time without hesitation. "You saved us," he said. Clara shook her head once. "The wall did." Atlas leaned against her leg, steady and quiet. By late afternoon, distant engine noise carried faintly from the valley below, utility crews beginning to restore power lines. The town would recover, but the memory of the night would not fade quickly. Clara walked once more to the thermometer and recorded the final morning reading. Exterior wind chill, approximately minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit interior, ambient, 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 41 degrees warmer than the outside wind. But the number felt heavier now. Not theoretical. Proven. Outside, the storm finally loosened its grip. Inside, the cabin held its heat, and the people within it began to breathe normally again. By mid-afternoon, the first utility truck crested the hill below Clara's clearing. Its bright orange lights blinked against the white landscape like a distant flare of returning civilization. Inside the cabin, the air had steadied at 53 degrees. 17 people who had arrived in fear now moved carefully through the small space with something close to reverence. Boots were dried near the stove. Wet gloves hung along a makeshift line Clara had strung across 2 beams. The children, no longer trembling, sat cross-legged on the rug beside Atlas, tracing patterns in the frost that clung faintly to the lower window pane. As Darren stood near the west wall, studying it openly now. "So the wind hits this first," he said quietly. "Yes," Clara replied. "And the gap between the walls, that's what traps the air?" "Still air doesn't move heat as fast," she explained. "The outer wall takes the pressure. The air gap buffers it. The original logs don't get hit directly." Ray stepped closer, running his hand along the interior cedar. "Feels warmer than my place ever did." he admitted. Clara didn't respond to that. There was no edge in the room anymore. No mocking glances. No half-hidden smirks. Only quiet understanding. Around 3 o'clock, word began to spread through Silver Ridge that Clara Whitmore's cabin had stayed warm through the blackout. One by one, vehicles passed slowly along the road below her property. Not to stare this time, but to confirm. But by late afternoon, most of the families prepared to return home as power flickered back across town. Lacey wrapped scarves around her children carefully before turning to Clara. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "You already did," Clara answered. "You trusted the wall." Darren lingered near the door as the others stepped outside into the bright, blinding snow. He removed his gloves slowly. "I said some things," he began, "about what it looked like." Clara met his gaze evenly. "It looked strange," she said. "It looked like you were sealing yourself in," he admitted. Clara's eyes flicked briefly toward the west wall. "It was never about sealing in," she replied. "It was about keeping the worst out." Darren nodded slowly. "I should have asked before I laughed." She didn't answer that. He stepped outside and was closing the door gently behind him. For the first time in days, the cabin fell silent. Only Clara and Atlas remained. The room felt larger now, emptier, but warmer in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Clara crossed to the west wall again and rested her palm against the wood. The structure had done more than endure. It had protected. She stepped outside to clear snow from the porch steps. The afternoon sun reflected sharply off the drifts, casting the outer wall in bright, honest light. From this angle, it still looked awkward, layered, improvised. But it also looked deliberate. 2 trucks slowed near the road and parked. Darren climbed out of one, Ray from another. They walked up the clearing together. Clara watched them approach without speaking. Ray tipped his hat slightly. "We'd like to see it," he said, and she stepped aside and gestured toward the west side. They circled the structure carefully, inspecting the posts, the insulation boards, the air gap. Darren crouched near the base, brushing snow aside. "It held," he said simply. "It held," Clara echoed. Ray stood and looked at her differently now, not as the woman who should have left, but as the one who stayed and built. "How much warmer did you say?" Darren asked. 41 degrees above wind chill, she replied. Both men went quiet. "That's not luck," Ray said after a moment. "No," Clara answered. They stood there in the snow for several seconds longer, studying the once ridiculed structure. Darren finally cleared his throat. "If you're willing," he said carefully, "I'd like to build something similar on my place." Clara looked at him. "And Ray?" she asked. Ray nodded once. "Me too." The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Respect had replaced ridicule. Clara felt it settle quietly around her. Not pride in the loud sense. Not vindication shouted from rooftops. Something steadier. She walked back toward the cabin door, Atlas pacing beside her. Inside, she added a single log to the stove, not out of necessity, but habit. The thermometer read 54 degrees, stable. Outside, Silver Ridge was waking from its Arctic trial. But on the western edge of town, a double-walled cabin stood as proof of something far more durable than pride. And for the first time since the storm began, Clara allowed herself to feel it fully. Not victory, validation. The days after the storm felt strangely bright. Snow still blanketed the foothills outside Silver Ridge. But the air carried a softer edge. Utility trucks came and went. Pipes were repaired. Stories were told in the cafe with wide eyes and shaking heads. Clara stayed busy. She didn't wait for anyone to organize it. By the third morning after power returned, Darren Pike was back in her clearing, this time with a measuring tape and a legal pad instead of a smirk. "You said 8 inches?" he asked. "Minimum," Clara replied. "Consistent gap matters more than thickness." Atlas stood beside her, tail moving slowly, no longer bristling at Darren's presence. The dog's shift mirrored the town's. What had once been guarded was now calm. Clara knelt in the snow and sketched a simple side profile of the wall on Darren's notepad. 2 parallel lines, vertical supports, air gap marked clearly between them. The outer layer doesn't need to be pretty, she said. It needs to break the wind before it reaches your main structure. Darren nodded carefully, as if each word weighed more than it had a week ago. Ray Holloway arrived shortly after, carrying a thermos of coffee. He handed it to Clara without ceremony. "For the teacher," he said. She raised an eyebrow but accepted it. By the end of that week, Clara found herself walking from cabin to cabin along the outskirts of town, Atlas pacing faithfully beside her boots. She examined draft points, ran her infrared thermometer along log seams, tapped lightly against weakened boards. She didn't preach. She didn't scold. She explained. "Wind pressure forces cold through the smallest cracks," she told Ray, as she pointed to a seam near his back porch. "Oh, break the pressure before it reaches here." At Darren's place, she showed him how to secure vertical supports so they flexed slightly under stress without splitting. "Flexing isn't failure," she reminded him. "It's absorption." Word spread quietly. By mid-January, 3 cabins on the western edge of Silver Ridge wore the beginnings of outer frames. They looked awkward, layered, unfinished. But no one laughed this time. Atlas trotted between properties with steady confidence, greeting children who now ran toward him instead of shrinking back. Nora Jensen, recovering well after the storm, often stepped outside to watch Clara work, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. "Never thought insulation would look like hope," Nora said one afternoon. Clara didn't respond directly to that. She adjusted a support beam and stepped back to inspect the alignment. Late one evening, after she returned home from helping Darren seal his final insulation panel, the phone rang. She stared at it for a moment before answering. "Hi, Mom." Melissa's voice sounded different, less impatient, less strained. "I heard about the storm," Melissa continued. "Darren's sister posted something online. About you." Clara's brow furrowed slightly. "Posted what?" "That your cabin stayed warm. That you helped people." Clara leaned back in her chair, Atlas resting his head across her feet. "It held," she said simply. There was a pause. "I saw pictures," Melissa said quietly. "That wall you built." Clara braced herself for criticism since she no longer feared. Instead, Melissa continued, "It makes sense." Silence filled the line. I didn't understand before," Melissa admitted. "I thought you were just refusing to let go, trying to prove you could stay out there alone." Clara stared at the stove flame. "I wasn't trying to prove anything," she said gently. "I know that now." Another pause. "Can I come visit?" Melissa asked. "When the roads clear a bit more?" Clara blinked once in surprise at the softness in her daughter's tone. "Yes," she said. A week later, Melissa's rental car crunched slowly up the snowy driveway. Atlas noticed her before Clara did, lifting his head from the porch where he lay basking in pale winter sunlight. Clara stepped outside as Melissa climbed from the car, bundled in a heavy city coat that looked out of place against the mountain landscape. They stood facing each other for a moment, the outer wall rising visibly behind Clara's shoulder. "It looks different," Melissa said. "It works," Clara replied. Melissa walked slowly along the west side of the cabin, brushing snow from the lower boards with her gloved hand. She peered into the narrow air gap, studied the vertical supports, the careful spacing. "You really thought this through," she said quietly. "I measured it," Clara corrected. Inside, they sat at the table where Clara had first drawn her sketches. Atlas lay between them, chin resting on his paws. Melissa glanced at the thermometer mounted near the beam. "It's warm," she observed. "It stays that way." Melissa wrapped her hands around a mug of coffee. "I used to think you were building walls to keep people out," she said softly. Clara looked toward the west interior logs, the ones hidden now behind protection. "Sometimes you build something to keep the wind from taking more than it should," she said. Melissa nodded slowly. Later that afternoon, Melissa walked with Clara along the row of cabins now wearing their own outer frames. Darren waved from his porch. Ray lifted a hand from his ladder. The tone had shifted completely. Clara no longer walked through town as the woman who should have left. She walked as someone whose calculations had saved lives. Atlas moved easily between neighbors, no longer growling at slow-moving trucks. The suspicion that once hung over the clearing had dissolved into something steadier. Trust. That night, back inside her own cabin, Clara added a log to the stove and opened her notebook once more. She did not write numbers this time. She simply drew a small line beside the word reinforcement. Not for the wall, for herself. By the time the next winter arrived, Silver Ridge looked subtly different. The western edge of town, once a scatter of aging cabins bracing themselves alone against the mountain winds, now stood layered. Darren's place wore a clean, sturdy outer frame painted the same deep green as his original siding. Ray's cabin had a broader air gap, reinforced after Clara suggested extra bracing near the ridgeline. Even Nora and her husband had added a modest barrier to their smaller home. From a distance, it looked almost coordinated. From up close, it looked practical. Clara stood on her porch one early December morning, Atlas beside her, as the first heavy snow of the season drifted down. The sky was soft gray, yet the air carried the crisp warning of colder days ahead. She didn't feel the old unease this time. Inside the cabin, the stove burned gently. The thermometer held steady at 60 degrees. The outer wall, now fully finished and reinforced, stood solid against the western horizon. Melissa had visited twice over the summer. Once to help Clara reseal the lower seam along the north side. Once simply to sit on the porch and watch the sunset, without tension hanging between them. Their conversations were different now, less about convincing, more about listening. Atlas had grown thicker in his coat with the season change, his fur dense and silvered slightly along the muzzle. He moved with the same steady confidence he'd shown the night of the storm, but without the alert edge. The town had not forgotten that night. Every few weeks, someone mentioned it, at the post office, outside the cafe, along the road, when Clara's truck passed. There was no grand ceremony, no plaque, no official recognition. Just a quiet shift. Respect no longer needed to be spoken aloud. One evening, as wind began to rise again ahead of another cold front, Clara stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The outer wall caught the first strong gust with a muted thud. She paused and listened. The sound was familiar now, not threatening, not mocking. Just wind meeting structure. Atlas settled near the stove, sighing deeply. Clara crossed to the west interior wall and rested her hand against the cedar logs. Cool. Protected. She thought back to the word Ray had used that day in the clearing. Coffin. The memory didn't sting anymore. The wall had never been about shutting herself away. It had been about creating space. Space between force and vulnerability, between noise and stillness. The air gap held more than temperature. It held doubt at a distance. It held ridicule at arm's length. It held the quiet truth that she did not need permission to prepare. Snow began to fall harder, tapping softly against the outer boards. The storm wasn't as fierce as the one that had tested them before, but it carried the same mountain certainty. Clara walked to the table and opened her notebook, not to calculate, not to measure, just to look. On one page, the circled number still stood clear. 41 degrees warmer than exterior wind chill. She traced the edge of the circle lightly with her finger. The number had once felt surreal, then validating. Now it simply felt true. Atlas lifted his head and watched her, eyes calm, while she smiled faintly and closed the notebook. Outside, the wind strengthened, pressing against the barrier she had built with her own hands. The structure absorbed it quietly, distributing the force, protecting what stood behind it. Clara sat down in her chair and listened to the stove's steady crackle. She understood something now that she hadn't fully grasped when she first picked up the measuring tape. Sometimes the thing people laugh at is the very thing that keeps you alive. Sometimes the barrier you build to protect your dignity becomes the shelter that protects everyone else. Survival isn't just about staying warm through a storm.
It's about standing firm when the world assumes you are already finished. The wind howled once more against the west side of the cabin. Inside, Clara Whitmore and her German shepherd sat in steady warmth. the one between them and the storm howling exactly as it were meant to. And this time, no one was laughing. As the snow settled quietly around Silver Ridge, Lara Cabin stood not as a fortress, but as a roof that preparation isn't right, and resilience doesn't need applause. The ones she built out of quiet conviction become a shelter for more than just herself, and at last, it became a reminder that strength can look unusual before it looks wise. Have you ever been misunderstood for doing what you believe was right? If this story meant something to you, say a word in the comments that describe Lara. Stubborn, strong, despair, or one of your out. And if you believe stories like this still matter, you always welcome here.